In a quiet suburban neighborhood in California, a 72-year-old retired teacher was about to discover the ultimate family betrayal. What started as returning home from her beloved sister's funeral took a shocking turn when she came face to face with changed locks and a cruel note from her own family. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical vulnerable senior citizen. For 35 years, she had spent her life educating thousands of students as an ESL teacher, known for her fierce independence and unwavering dignity after immigrating from Taiwan, and raising two sons as a single mother. When she encountered her daughter-in-law's calculated scheme to force her into assisted living, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would test everything she believed about family loyalty. Margaret's refusal to surrender quietly would lead to a legal fight that would expose the dark reality of elder abuse in America. What began as a property dispute would become a powerful movement for elder rights. The entire community would never be the same after witnessing how one woman's courage to fight back could inspire others to stand up against those who prey on the vulnerable. This is the story of how Margaret Chen transformed from victim to advocate, proving that it's never too late to find your voice, and that sometimes the worst betrayals can become the foundation for the most important work of your life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The taxi's worn vinyl seat creaked as Margaret Chen shifted, her arthritic fingers clutching the small black purse that held Eleanor's funeral program. Through the rain-streaked window, the familiar streets of her neighborhood blurred past, the same route she'd traveled thousands of times. But today, everything felt different. Today, Eleanor wasn't waiting at home with tea and gentle questions about her day. "Rough day, ma'am?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The funeral had been everything Eleanor would have wanted: simple, dignified, filled with the quiet respect of a woman who'd spent her final months accepting her fate with grace. But now, in the silence of the taxi, the weight of solitude pressed against Margaret's chest like a physical thing. "Family first? Always family?" Eleanor had whispered during those last weeks, her voice thin but insistent. "Promise me you'll trust David and Michael. They love you, even when they don't show it well." The promise had been easy to make then, with Eleanor's hand warm in hers, and the belief that family was the one constant in an uncertain world. Now, at 72, Margaret felt that certainty crumbling like the autumn leaves scattered across her front lawn. "Here we are," the driver announced, pulling up to the modest two-story house that had been Margaret's anchor for 40 years. The white paint needed touching up, and the garden showed signs of neglect from Eleanor's illness. But it was home, the place where she'd raised two sons, weathered her husband's early death, and built a life one careful decision at a time. Margaret paid the fare and stepped onto the sidewalk, her sensible black shoes splashing in a small puddle. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Autumn in full swing, the season Eleanor had always loved best. She stood for a moment, drawing strength from the sight of her front door, painted the same cheerful blue she'd chosen when David was still in elementary school. The first sign something was wrong came when her key refused to turn. Margaret frowned, jiggling the key in the lock. After 40 years, the mechanism should have been as familiar as breathing. She tried again, checking to make sure she had the right key, though she'd used this same one just that morning before leaving for the funeral. Come on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle patter of rain. The key turned partially, then stopped, as if something inside the lock had changed. A cold certainty began settling in her stomach. Margaret walked around to the back door, her steps quickening despite the uneven flagstones that always worried Eleanor. The spare key she kept hidden under the ceramic frog, a gift from one of her former ESL students, was gone. The back door lock had been changed too. Margaret's hands began to shake as she tried the kitchen window, then the basement entrance, each attempt confirming what her mind struggled to accept. Someone had changed every lock on her house. Someone who had access. Someone who knew she'd be away today, grieving at her sister's funeral. The note was waiting on the front door when she returned, taped precisely in the center of the blue paint. Margaret's name was written in Victoria's careful script, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and Christmas gifts for the past 8 years. Margaret, the note began, each word hitting like a physical blow. After careful consideration and consultation with David, we believe it's time for you to accept assisted living arrangements. You'll be much safer and happier with professional care. We've changed the locks for security reasons, and we'll be in touch about next steps. This is what's best for everyone. Victoria Margaret read the note 3 times, each reading making the words more real and more impossible. The rain had started falling harder, soaking through her funeral dress, but she couldn't move. Couldn't process the calculated cruelty of the timing, the clinical language that reduced her life to a problem requiring a solution. David, her younger son, who still called her every Sunday, who brought his children for holiday dinners, who had hugged her just last week after Eleanor's diagnosis became terminal. David, who had married Victoria 8 years ago and seemed so grateful to have found someone who understood his gentle nature. With trembling fingers, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed David's number. It went straight to voicemail, his cheerful voice asking callers to leave a message, promising to get back to them soon. The same message she'd heard dozens of times when he was working a job site and couldn't answer. "David, it's your mother." Her voice cracked on the words. "I need you to call me immediately. Someone has changed all the locks on my house. I don't understand what's happening. Please call me." She hung up and immediately dialed again, as if repetition might somehow produce a different result. Voicemail again. Then a 3rd time, her desperation growing with each unanswered ring. "Margaret? Margaret, honey, what's wrong?" The voice came from next door, where Rosa Delgado stood on her own front porch, concern written across her weathered face. Rosa had been Margaret's neighbor for 15 years, ever since her husband Carlos had taken the job at the high school. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed things: mail piling up, lights left on too long, the subtle signs that someone might need help. "I can't get into my house," Margaret managed, her voice small in the rain. "Someone changed the locks." Rosa's expression shifted from concern to something harder, more focused. Margaret had seen that look before. It was Rosa's social worker face, the one she'd worn during 30 years of helping families navigate crises. "Come inside," Rosa said firmly. "Right now. We'll figure this out." Margaret allowed herself to be guided across the small strip of lawn that separated their properties, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Rosa's living room was warm and bright, filled with the scent of coffee and the soft music Carlos always played in the evenings. It was everything Margaret's house should have been at this moment: welcoming, safe, home. "Sit," Rosa commanded, disappearing into the kitchen and returning with a steaming mug. "Tell me exactly what happened." Margaret explained about the keys, the note, David's silence. With each detail, Rosa's expression grew darker, her hands clenching into fists. That calculating. Rosa caught herself, switching to rapid Spanish, that Margaret didn't need to understand to recognize as profanity. "I'm sorry, honey, but this is elder abuse. Textbook financial exploitation." "But it's David," Margaret protested weakly. "He wouldn't—" "David isn't the one making decisions anymore," Rosa said gently. "And that woman, I've watched her, Margaret. The way she looks at your house, asks questions about property values. She's been planning this. The truth of—" It settled over Margaret like a weight. Victoria, who had seemed so caring during Eleanor's illness, bringing casseroles and offering to help with errands. Victoria, who had married David when his contracting business was struggling and his confidence was at its lowest. Victoria, who had never quite been able to hide her interest in the neighborhood's rising property values. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself on Rosa's couch with a borrowed nightgown and a mind that refused to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eleanor's face during those final conversations, the way her sister had insisted on the importance of family, of trust, of keeping the bond strong even when times were difficult. "I failed you," Margaret thought, staring at the ceiling. "I trusted them, just like you asked, and they took everything." But beneath the grief and betrayal, something else was stirring. A spark of the same determination that had brought her to America 45 years ago with nothing but hope and a fierce belief in the possibility of building something better. The same resolve that had carried her through her husband's death and single motherhood and 35 years in classrooms full of children who needed someone to believe in them. Victoria might have taken her keys, but she hadn't taken everything. Not yet. In the darkness of Rosa's living room, Margaret Chen began to plan her fight back. Margaret woke before dawn on Rosa's couch, her neck stiff and her mind already racing. The events of yesterday felt like a nightmare that refused to fade with morning light. Through the window, she could see her own house. So close she could count the steps to her front door, yet impossibly distant behind those changed locks. "Coffee's ready," Rosa announced, emerging from the kitchen fully dressed despite the early hour. "We have work to do." Over breakfast, Rosa spread out a legal pad covered with her neat handwriting. "I made some calls last night. We're going to the courthouse first thing. You need to understand your rights before we do anything else." The county courthouse was an imposing brick building that Margaret had passed countless times but never entered. Inside, the marble floors echoed with their footsteps as Rosa navigated the maze of offices with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades working within the system. "Elder law information," Rosa read from a directory. "Third floor." The elevator was old and slow, giving Margaret time to study her reflection in the polished doors. She looked every one of her 72 years this morning, pale, fragile, exactly the kind of person someone might assume needed protecting from herself. The thought sparked a flame of anger that had been building since yesterday. The elder law office was cramped but welcoming, staffed by volunteers who clearly understood the desperation that brought people through their doors. A young woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair looked up from a stack of papers as they approached. "I'm Sarah Brennan," she said, extending her hand. "How can I help you?" Margaret found herself telling the story again, the funeral, the locks, the note. With each word, Sarah's expression grew more serious, her pen moving rapidly across a legal pad. "This is textbook elder abuse," Sarah said when Margaret finished. "Financial exploitation with elements of emotional manipulation. The timing alone, changing locks while you were at a funeral, shows premeditation." "But what can I do?" Margaret asked. "It's my house, but David is on the deed as co-owner. Victoria is his wife." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. "Being on a deed doesn't give someone the right to lock out another owner without legal process, and certainly not without your consent." She paused, something personal flickering across her face. "My grandmother went through something similar. Family members who thought they knew what was best for her, but really just wanted control of her assets." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked quietly. "She fought back. It took 2 years, but she got her independence back and lived on her own terms until she was 91. Sarah's smile was fierce. "That's what we're going to do for you." As they left the courthouse with a folder full of information about elder rights and legal protections, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since finding that note: hope. Their next stop was Dr. Kim's office, where Margaret had been a patient for over 20 years. Dr. Kim, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, listened to her story with growing concern. "Margaret, you're one of my sharpest patients," he said after conducting a brief cognitive assessment. Your memory is excellent. Your judgment is sound, and you're fully capable of making your own decisions. He handed her a formal letter on his letterhead. I've documented your mental competency here. If anyone tries to claim otherwise, they'll have to explain why they disagree with my professional assessment. Margaret tucked the letter carefully into her purse, feeling another piece of armor settling into place. It was Rosa who suggested talking to Tommy Nakamura, the 17-year-old who lived 2 houses down with his grandmother. That boy knows computers better than anyone I've ever met, she said. If Victoria's been planning this, there might be digital evidence. Tommy listened to their story with the intense focus of someone who understood injustice in clear, simple terms. His dark eyes flashed with anger when Margaret described the note. That's so messed up, he said, then caught himself. Sorry, Mrs. Chen, but this is exactly the kind of thing my generation needs to fight against. Elder abuse is epidemic, and most people don't even recognize it. Can you help us? Rosa asked. Tommy's fingers were already flying across his laptop keyboard. Victoria Martinez Chen, right? Let me see what she's been researching online. What he found made Margaret's blood run cold. Victoria had been visiting websites about conservatorships, assisted living facilities, and property transfers for months. Her browser history showed searches for forcing elderly relatives into care and how to prove mental incompetence. She was planning this long before Eleanor got sick, Tommy said, his voice tight with disgust. Look at these dates. Some of these searches go back 6 months. Margaret stared at the screen, seeing her betrayal laid out in digital breadcrumbs. Victoria hadn't acted impulsively or out of sudden concern. She had been systematically planning to remove Margaret from her own home. The phone call from David came that afternoon, while Margaret was reviewing the legal documents Sarah had given her. His voice sounded strained, distant. Mom, I got your message about the house. David. Margaret's voice was steady, though her hands shook. Come home. We need to talk. I can't right now. I'm on a job site in Sacramento. But Mom. He paused, and she could hear traffic in the background. Maybe Victoria's right. Maybe this is for the best. You've been through so much with Eleanor, and the house is getting too big for you. The house is not too big for me, Margaret said firmly. And I didn't agree to any of this. Your wife changed my locks while I was burying my sister. She's just worried about you. We both are. There are some really nice places. David Chen. Margaret's teacher voice cut through his rambling. Come home and look me in the eye when you say that. The line went quiet for a long moment. I'll try to get away this weekend. After he hung up, Margaret sat staring at the phone. That wasn't her son speaking. That was Victoria's words coming out of David's mouth. The confrontation came at sunset, when Margaret was walking back from Rosa's mailbox. Victoria's car pulled up to the curb, and Margaret's daughter-in-law stepped out wearing a carefully composed expression of concern. Margaret, there you are. I've been so worried. Victoria's voice carried just the right note of loving care. Rosa called and said you were staying with her. You must have been so confused yesterday. I wasn't confused, Margaret said calmly. I was locked out of my own house. Victoria's mask slipped slightly. Well, yes, we had to secure the property, for insurance reasons. But I've found several wonderful assisted living facilities that would be perfect for you. Places where you'd have help with meals, medication management. I don't need help with meals or medications. Of course you do, honey. Victoria's tone became more condescending. You're 72 years old. You can't possibly maintain that big house on your own, especially with your arthritis. And frankly, after Eleanor's death, we're all concerned about your emotional state. Margaret felt Rosa's presence behind her. Her neighbor had emerged from her house and was standing silently in support. My emotional state, Margaret repeated slowly, is angry. angry that someone would betray my trust, steal my keys, and try to force me from my home while I was grieving my sister. Victoria's facade cracked completely. I'm trying to help you, Margaret. David and I are trying to do what's best for the family. That house is worth over $600,000 now. It's an asset that needs to be managed properly. There. It was. The truth finally spoken aloud. This wasn't about Margaret's well-being. It was about money. Get off my property, Margaret said quietly. Actually, Victoria smiled coldly, I have every right to be here. David and I are protecting family interests now. She got back in her car and drove away, leaving Margaret standing on the sidewalk with a crystal-clear understanding of exactly what she was fighting against. That evening, as Rosa helped her organize the legal documents and Tommy printed out evidence of Victoria's online research, Margaret felt the last of her shock and confusion burning away. In its place was something harder and more focused. She was going to need Michael. Margaret stared at the piece of paper Rosa had given her, Michael's business card from his last visit 2 years ago. The embossed letters read, Michael Chen, Senior Vice President, Strategic Development, Nexus Technologies. She remembered the pride she'd felt when he'd first shown her the card, followed immediately by the hollow ache of knowing her successful son felt like a stranger. You sure about this? Rosa asked gently. I know things between you two have been complicated, Margaret finished. That was putting it mildly. Michael had been her firstborn, her brilliant boy who'd earned a full scholarship to Stanford and never looked back. Somewhere in his rise to Silicon Valley's success, he'd also stopped looking home. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar voice answered, crisp and professional. Michael Chen. Michael, it's your mother. A pause. Then, in a slightly softer tone, Mom, is everything okay? How's Eleanor? Margaret's throat tightened. Of course he wouldn't know. She'd tried calling him before the funeral, but he'd been in meetings. She'd left a message that he'd apparently never gotten. Eleanor died 4 days ago, she said quietly. The funeral was yesterday. The silence stretched so long Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Michael's voice came through, strained and distant. I'm sorry, I didn't. My assistant usually screens my calls better than that. I should have been there. Yes, you should have. The words came out sharper than Margaret intended, but she was too tired to soften them. Another pause. Mom, I'm in the middle of a major product launch. I've got board meetings scheduled through Michael. Margaret closed her eyes, swallowing. Her pride. I need your help. She told him about the locks, the note, Victoria's threats. With each detail, she could hear his breathing change on the other end of the line. Wait, he interrupted. You're saying Victoria locked you out of your own house? While you were at Eleanor's funeral? Yes. And David is going along with this? Margaret heard something shifting in Michael's voice, a hard edge that reminded her of the boy who'd once gotten suspended for fighting 3 older kids who were bullying his younger brother. He says it's for the best, that I need assisted living. Bullshit. The profanity was sharp, angry. Mom, you're sharper than half the executives I work with. This is financial elder abuse, pure and simple. Margaret felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought tears. After 2 days of being told she was confused, incompetent, and in need of care, hearing Michael acknowledge her capability felt like oxygen to someone drowning. I'm coming home, he said. Tonight. Don't sign anything, don't talk to Victoria without a witness, and document everything. After he hung up, Margaret sat holding the phone, remembering another conversation they'd had 8 years ago in this same house. Michael had just been promoted again, and she'd asked when he might find time to visit more often, maybe bring someone special to meet her. His response had been cutting. Mom, I'm building something important here. I can't drop everything every time you feel lonely. David lives 20 minutes away. Lean on him for the family stuff. The words had stung then and still did now. But perhaps they'd also been prophetic. She had leaned on David, and look where that had gotten her. Rosa found her lost in thought and squeezed her shoulder. He's coming? He's coming. On the red-eye flight from San Francisco, Michael stared out at the dark landscape below and tried to process what he'd heard. Victoria had always struck him as calculating, but this level of manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. And David. Michael remembered their last conversation 6 months ago when David had called asking for another loan. Just until this next contract comes through, David had said, the same promise he'd been making for years. Michael had wired the money without question, as he always did, but he'd also felt the familiar frustration with his younger brother's inability to take control of his own life. Now that weakness had been weaponized against their mother, the flight attendant offered him coffee, and Michael declined, his mind racing through possibilities. Property law wasn't his expertise, but business strategy was. Victoria had made a critical error. She'd revealed her hand too early and too completely. The timing, the methods, the transparent financial motivation, all of it could be used against her. But first, he needed to see his mother. Really see her, not the brief, dutiful visits he'd made over the years, where he'd checked his phone more than he'd looked at her face. Rosa answered the door when he knocked at 6 a.m., her expression mixing relief with something that might have been judgment. She's sleeping, Rosa said quietly, leading him to the kitchen. First real rest she's gotten since this started. Michael looked around Rosa's modest living room, seeing his mother's belongings scattered on the coffee table. Reading glasses, a book of crossword puzzles, the small photo of Eleanor she always kept nearby. The sight of his 72-year-old mother's life reduced to the contents of an overnight bag hit him harder than he'd expected. How bad is it really? He asked. Rosa's dark eyes flashed. Your brother's wife is trying to steal your mother's house. How bad do you think it is? Before Michael could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway wearing a borrowed robe, her gray hair slightly mussed from sleep. In the morning light, she looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but her eyes were alert and determined. You came? She said simply. Of course I came. The words felt inadequate, carrying too much weight and not enough history. Over coffee, Margaret walked him through everything. The legal consultation, Tommy's digital detective work, Dr. Kim's competency evaluation. Michael found himself impressed despite everything. His mother wasn't just reacting to the crisis, she was building a case. I need to see the house, he said, and then I want to talk to this lawyer, Sarah Brennan. They were standing on the sidewalk in front of Margaret's house when Victoria's car pulled up. Michael watched his sister-in-law get out, her face lighting up with practiced surprise. Michael, what a wonderful surprise. I had no idea you were coming to visit. Her voice carried just the right note of warm welcome, but Michael noticed how her eyes quickly assessed his expensive suit and watch. Victoria. His tone was politely neutral, the same voice he used with competitors in business negotiations. I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying to help your mother understand that she needs more support now. At her age, living alone in such a big house. Victoria gestured helplessly, as if confronting an inevitable tragedy. My mother seems perfectly capable to me. Of course she does. She's very good at hiding her limitations. But Michael, as family, we have to make the hard decisions. The responsible decisions. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, I'm worried about her finances too. The house needs so much work, and on her teacher's pension. Michael felt a cold anger settling in his chest. He'd seen this exact technique in boardrooms, the false intimacy, the manufactured urgency, the way Victoria was trying to position herself as his ally against their mutual problem. "I appreciate your concern," he said carefully, "but I'll be handling my mother's situation from here." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "I'm not sure you understand how complex this is, David. And I have been managing things for—" "David and you have been managing nothing," Michael interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to ending discussions. "You've been scheming. And now that stops." He turned to his mother. "Mom, let's go call Sarah Brennan. I want to retain her services immediately." As they walked away, Michael could feel Victoria's stare burning into his back. He'd just declared war, and they both knew it. An hour later, in Sarah Brennan's office, Michael listened as the lawyer outlined their options. Her passion for the case was evident, and he found himself trusting her instincts. "I'll cover all legal expenses," he told Sarah. "Whatever this takes." Margaret started to protest, but Michael held up a hand. "Mom, I should have been here before this happened. I should have been paying attention. Let me pay attention now." Sarah nodded approvingly. "With proper resources, we can move fast. File for an emergency injunction, force them to return the keys, and start building a case for financial elder abuse charges." For the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret felt like she might actually win. And for the first time in years, she felt like she had her son back. But outside Sarah's office, Victoria was already making calls of her own. If Michael wanted a war, she'd give him one. The papers arrived by courier at 7 a.m., 3 days after Michael's confrontation with Victoria. Rosa signed for them with trembling hands, recognizing the official seal of the county court system. Inside, the legal language was dense and clinical, but the meaning was devastatingly clear. Petition for emergency conservatorship of the person and estate of Margaret Chen. Margaret read the document while sitting at Rosa's kitchen table, her coffee growing cold as each paragraph revealed the calculated cruelty of Victoria's response. According to the filing, Margaret was suffering from significant cognitive decline, was unable to manage her financial affairs, and posed a danger to herself and others through poor judgment and erratic behavior. "This is fiction," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. But Victoria had been thorough. Attached to the petition were witness statements, medical concerns, and what appeared to be Margaret's own signature on a document expressing interest in assisted living facilities. The signature looked authentic. Margaret stared at it, trying to remember when she might have signed such a thing. "She forged it," Michael said grimly, studying the document over Margaret's shoulder. "Had to be. When would you have signed this?" Margaret shook her head, but doubt crept in at the edges of her certainty. Eleanor's illness had been exhausting. There had been so many papers to sign: insurance forms, medical releases, pharmacy authorizations. Had Victoria slipped something past her during those overwhelming weeks? The doorbell rang, and Rosa returned from answering it with 2 women in conservative business suits. The older one, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, introduced herself as Janet Morrison from Adult Protective Services. "Mrs. Chen, we've received a concerning report about your living situation. I need to conduct a wellness check and competency assessment." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm perfectly competent." "I'm sure you believe that," Ms. Morrison said in the patronizing tone people used with confused elderly relatives. "But we need to verify that for ourselves. It's for your own protection." The next hour was a humiliation that burned deeper than any physical pain Margaret had ever experienced. She was asked to count backward from 100 by sevens, to recall 3 words after a 5-minute delay, to explain what she would do if she found a stamped envelope on the street. Simple questions that felt like accusations, delivered by a woman who had already decided what the answers meant. "Mrs. Chen, when was the last time you paid your bills?" Ms. Morrison asked, pen poised over her clipboard. "I pay them online." Every month, on the 15th. Do you remember your password? Margaret hesitated. She'd written her passwords in a small notebook that she kept in her purse, a practice Michael had recommended for security, but admitting that would probably be recorded as evidence of cognitive decline. It's written down, she said carefully. Ms. Morrison made a note. And who helps you with grocery shopping? I do my own shopping. How do you get to the store? I drive. Margaret saw the woman's eyebrows raise slightly. I've been driving for 50 years without an accident. More notes. Each answer seemed to confirm something in Ms. Morrison's mind, though Margaret couldn't understand what she was doing wrong. The younger woman, introduced as a court investigator, asked about Margaret's living arrangements. Mrs. Chen, you're currently staying with a neighbor? Temporarily, because someone changed the locks on my house. And why do you think someone would do that? The question was a trap. If Margaret explained about Victoria's scheme, she'd sound paranoid. If she didn't, she'd seem confused about her own circumstances. Because my daughter-in-law wants to force me into assisted living so she can sell my house, Margaret said clearly, deciding that the truth was her only option. The investigator exchanged a glance with Ms. Morrison. That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Chen. Do you have any evidence of this conspiracy? Conspiracy. The word made Margaret's claims sound delusional. After the social workers left, Margaret slumped in Rose's chair, feeling defeated. They think I'm crazy. They think what Victoria wants them to think, Michael said angrily. He was pacing Rose's living room like a caged animal. This is exactly what she was planning. Get official agencies involved, create a paper trail of incompetency, then use the system to validate her position. Sarah Brennan arrived an hour later with her own stack of papers. Dr. Kim's competency evaluation, character references from Margaret's former colleagues, bank statements showing perfectly managed finances. But she looked worried. The conservatorship. Hearing is scheduled for next week, Sarah said. That's unusually fast. Victoria must have convinced the court this is an emergency situation. What kind of emergency? Rosa demanded. Sarah's expression was grim. According to her filing, Margaret threatened to hurt herself, said she'd rather die than leave her house. Margaret stared at her. I never said that. She has a witness. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. David Chen, her younger son, the gentle boy who used to bring her dandelions and call her his best friend, had signed a statement claiming his mother was suicidal and delusional. Margaret excused herself and walked to Rose's bathroom, where she locked the door and finally allowed herself to break down. The tears came in waves, for Eleanor's death, for David's betrayal, for the violation of everything she'd believed about family loyalty. She wept for the naive woman who had trusted blindly, and for the future that seemed to be slipping away with each legal maneuver. A soft knock on the door interrupted her grief. Margaret, Rosa's voice was gentle. There's someone here to see you. Margaret splashed cold water on her face and returned to the living room to find Tommy Nakamura with his laptop, his young face set in determined lines. Mrs. Chen, I've been doing more research on Victoria's online activity. You need to see this. Tommy's screen showed social media posts and neighborhood forum comments going back several months. Victoria had been carefully seeding doubt about Margaret's mental state, sharing concerns about elderly neighbors who might need help, and asking for recommendations about memory care facilities for loved ones. She's been building a narrative, Tommy explained. Look at this post from 6 weeks ago. He pointed to a comment Victoria had made. Sometimes the hardest thing about loving someone is recognizing when they can't take care of themselves anymore. Has anyone dealt with a family member who refuses help? The responses were sympathetic, supportive of the difficult position Victoria claimed to be in. She'd positioned herself as the caring daughter-in-law facing a stubborn, declining mother-in-law. It gets worse, Tommy continued, scrolling through more posts. She's been reaching out to your neighbors, especially the ones who don't know you well. Mrs. Patterson at the end of the street, the new family that moved in last year. She's been telling them you've seemed confused lately, asking the same questions repeatedly. Margaret felt sick. Victoria hadn't just attacked her legally, she'd systematically destroyed her reputation in her own neighborhood. Michael studied the screen with the same intensity he brought to business problems. "This actually helps us," he said finally. "It shows premeditation. No one builds this kind of campaign unless they're planning something." "But will the court see it that way?" Sarah asked. "Or will they see it as evidence that Victoria has legitimate concerns about Margaret's well-being?" The question hung in the air as Margaret realized the full scope of what she was facing. Victoria hadn't just stolen her keys, she'd stolen her story, replacing Margaret's version of events with a carefully crafted narrative of decline and danger. That evening, David finally called. His voice was strained, guilty, but still weak. "Mom, I'm sorry about the legal stuff. Victoria said we had to move fast to protect you." "Protect me from what, David?" "From yourself. You've been so sad since Eleanor died, and you said some things that worried us." Margaret's heart broke a little more. "What things?" "About not wanting to live without her. About the house being all you had left." She remembered the conversation now, a moment of raw grief when she'd told David how lost she felt, how the house was her only remaining connection to the life she'd built. Victoria had been there, offering tissues and sympathy, while apparently cataloging every vulnerable word for future use. "David, those were normal expressions of grief. I wasn't threatening to hurt myself. But Victoria thinks about money, David. About $600,000 worth of real estate. How much debt are you in?" The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. "She's going to destroy our family," Margaret said quietly. "Is whatever she's promising you worth that?" "Mom, David's voice cracked. "I can't lose the house. My house. We'll lose everything." Margaret closed her eyes, understanding finally that her son was already lost. Victoria had made sure of that too. But as devastating as David's betrayal was, Margaret found something unexpected in its wake, a clarity she hadn't possessed before. She knew exactly what she was fighting now, and exactly what the stakes were. The conservatorship hearing was in 5 days. 5 days to prove she was competent, capable, and deserving of her own life. 5 days to save herself. The community. Meeting began with 8 people in Rose's living room and grew to 25 as word spread through the neighborhood. Margaret watched in amazement as her neighbors filed through Rose's front door. Some she'd known for decades. Others she recognized only from passing waves during her evening walks. Mrs. Patterson from the corner house surprised everyone by arriving with a plate of cookies and a fierce expression. "I heard what that woman has been saying about you, Margaret. Asking me if I'd noticed you wandering around confused. I told her you're the sharpest person on this street." Carlos Delgado, Rose's husband, stood near the back of the room with several other men from the neighborhood. "My wife tells me this is about more than just Margaret," he said. "This is about whether any of us are safe in our own homes when we get older." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the support, but also embarrassed by the attention. She'd spent her life being quietly helpful, tutoring struggling students, organizing food drives, volunteering at the library. She'd never thought of herself as someone who inspired rallies. "The hearing is in 4 days," Sarah explained to the gathered neighbors. "We need character witnesses, people who can testify about Margaret's mental acuity and community involvement. But more than that, we need to show the court that forcing her from her home would be a loss for everyone." Tommy had been quiet in the corner, typing rapidly on his laptop. Now he looked up with the kind of excitement that only teenagers could generate. "Mrs. Chen, how many students did you teach over 35 years?" Margaret tried to calculate. "Thousands, I suppose." "Why?" "Because I just created Justice for Margaret on social media, and I'm going to find as many of them as possible." His fingers flew across the keyboard. "I've already got responses from 12 people in the first hour." "Tommy, I don't want to be some internet sensation," Margaret protested. "You won't be," he assured her. "But your students will want to know what's happening. They'll want to help." By the next morning, Tommy's prediction had proven conservative. Margaret's phone buzzed constantly with calls from former students, now doctors, teachers, business owners, parents themselves, who had seen Tommy's posts and wanted to offer support. Dr. Elena Vasquez called from Phoenix, where she ran a pediatric clinic. "Mrs. Chen, you probably don't remember me, but I was in your ESL class in 1995. You helped me write my college application essays. Without you, I never would have become a doctor." Margaret did remember, a shy girl whose family had moved from Mexico, brilliant but convinced she wasn't smart enough for college. "Elena, of course I remember. You wrote the most beautiful essay about your grandmother's hands." "I'm flying to California for your hearing," Elena said firmly. "And I'm bringing a letter signed by 50 other former students. We're not letting anyone take away the woman who taught us we could become anything." Similar calls came throughout the day. A software engineer who credited Margaret with teaching him to believe in himself. A nurse who said Margaret's kindness had inspired her career choice. A small business owner who remembered how Margaret had stayed after school to help him with his English until he could keep up with his classmates. Sarah documented each offer of support, building a file that grew thicker by the hour. "This is unprecedented," she told Margaret. "I've never seen anything like this level of community response." The media attention started with a local news blog that Tommy had contacted. The story, headlined, "Beloved Teacher Faces Elder Abuse by Family," was picked up by the regional newspaper and then by a Sacramento television station. Margaret watched the evening news report from Rosa's couch, feeling surreal as her story was told to thousands of strangers. The reporter, a young woman with serious eyes, framed the case as part of a growing epidemic of elder financial abuse. "Margaret Chen represents thousands of vulnerable seniors who face similar situations," the reporter concluded. "Her case could set important precedents for protecting elderly homeowners from family exploitation." The coverage brought an unexpected call from Victoria's former employer. The marketing director, a woman named Janet Sullivan, asked to speak with Sarah privately. "Victoria Martinez was terminated 6 months ago," Janet told Sarah over the phone. "Not for performance issues, but for falsifying expense reports. She'd been stealing from the company for over a year. We chose not to prosecute, but we have documentation of everything." Sarah shared this information with Margaret and Michael that evening. "It establishes a pattern of financial dishonesty," she explained, "and it explains why Victoria became so desperate. She's facing bankruptcy." Michael nodded grimly. "Which makes Margaret's house look like her only way out." The revelations strengthened their case, but Margaret found herself thinking about David. How much of Victoria's desperation had she shared with him? How much pressure was he under? Rosa organized a second neighborhood meeting for the evening before the hearing, this time in the community center to accommodate the growing crowd. Margaret arrived to find over 60 people waiting, including several former students who had driven from other cities to attend. But the most moving moment came when Tommy introduced Margaret to Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s who had brought her teenage daughter. "Mrs. Chen taught my mother English when she first came to this country," Maria explained. "My mother died 5 years ago, but she never stopped talking about the teacher who made her feel like she belonged here. When I saw Tommy's posts, I knew I had to come." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret remembered Maria's mother, a quiet woman who had been terrified of making mistakes in class, but had been determined to learn. Seeing Maria's daughter, a confident young woman preparing for college, Margaret realized the ripple effects of her work in ways she'd never considered. "You changed our family's entire trajectory," Maria said simply. "My daughter is going to be an engineer because her grandmother learned to believe in education from you." The emotion in the room was palpable as person after person shared similar stories. Margaret began to understand that this fight wasn't just about her house. It was about recognizing the value of a life lived in service to others. The decision to return to her own house came to Margaret suddenly during the meeting. She stood up while Rosa was organizing volunteer schedules and said simply, "I want to go home." "Margaret, you can't get in," Rosa reminded her gently. "I can sit on my own front porch," Margaret replied. "It's still my house." What began as a simple statement became an impromptu march as the entire community meeting decided to accompany Margaret to her home. They walked through the neighborhood in the gathering dusk, a quiet procession of neighbors, former students, and supporters. Margaret's front porch had never held so many people. Someone brought folding chairs from the community center. Tommy set up a live stream of the peaceful gathering. Former students took turns sharing memories of Margaret's classroom. The scene was beautiful and powerful until Victoria arrived. She pulled up to the curb just as a news van from Sacramento was filming interviews with Margaret's supporters. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law's face transform as she took in the crowd, the cameras, the obvious support for Margaret's cause. Victoria pushed through the crowd with barely contained fury. "This is harassment," she announced loudly. "This woman is mentally ill, and you're all enabling her delusions." The neighbors who had been charmed by Victoria's earlier manipulations now saw her true face. Her voice was shrill, her movements aggressive. When Carlos Delgado politely asked her to lower her voice, she turned on him with a venomous response. "Don't tell me what to do. This is family business, and you people need to mind your own affairs." "Margaret is our affair," Mrs. Patterson replied calmly. "She's been our neighbor and friend for decades. You've been here 8 years and spent most of them looking for ways to profit from that friendship." Victoria's mask completely fell away. "You have no idea what you're talking about. That house is worth over $600,000 and she's too old to maintain it. She's wasting a valuable asset that should be managed properly." The crowd fell silent. Victoria had just confirmed on camera exactly what Margaret had been claiming all along. This was about money, not care. Tommy, still live streaming, made sure the camera captured Victoria's outburst. The clip would be shared thousands of times. Over the next 24 hours, becoming a viral symbol of elder abuse and family greed. As Victoria stormed away, threatening legal action against the trespassers, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope that felt solid and unshakable. Dr. Kim arrived at the gathering an hour later with a manila folder, full of test results. "Margaret, I've completed the most comprehensive cognitive assessment possible," he announced to the crowd. "Your memory, reasoning, and judgment are all well within normal ranges for someone your age. In fact, your scores are above average for any age group." The cheers from the crowd were audible 3 blocks away. Sarah pulled Margaret aside as the gathering began to wind down. "We have an incredibly strong case now," she said. "The community support, the medical documentation, Victoria's public outburst. It all creates a compelling narrative of a competent woman being manipulated by a greedy family member." "What about David?" Margaret asked quietly. Sarah's expression softened. "That's still the wild card. If he testifies against you tomorrow, it could complicate things. But after tonight, after seeing this level of community support, he might reconsider his position." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret remained on her front porch with Rosa, Tommy, and Michael. The news van had captured hours of footage, and Tommy's live stream had reached over 50,000 viewers. I never imagined anything like this, Margaret I admitted. You touched a lot of lives, Michael said quietly. I'm just sorry it took something like this for me to see it. Margaret looked at her estranged son, really looked at him, and saw not the successful executive who had distanced himself from family, but the boy who had once been so proud to have a teacher for a mother. You're here now, she said simply. That's what matters. As they prepared to return to Rose's house for the night, Margaret took one last look at her front door. Tomorrow's hearing would determine whether she'd ever use her key again, but tonight she felt surrounded by something stronger than locks, a community that refused to let her fight alone. The viral video of Victoria's outburst was already being shared by elder rights organizations across the country. Margaret Chen's case was becoming more than a local property dispute. It was becoming a symbol of resistance against a system that too often dismissed the elderly as burdens rather than recognizing them as treasures. But symbols were one thing. Tomorrow, in Judge Patricia Walsh's courtroom, Margaret would need to prove she was more than just a symbol. She was a competent, dignified woman who deserved to live her own life on her own terms. With the support of her community behind her, she finally believed she could do exactly that. The call came at dawn, Victoria's voice tight with barely controlled desperation. Margaret, still groggy from sleep on Rose's couch, almost didn't answer the unknown number. Margaret, we need to talk. I'm coming over. Victoria, I have nothing to say to. I'm selling the house. The words cut through Margaret's protest like a blade. Today, I have a developer ready to pay cash and close by the end of the week. Margaret's blood turned to ice. You can't sell my house. David's on the deed. As his wife, I have power of attorney for our financial decisions. The house will be demolished and turned into condos within 60 days. Victoria's voice carried a cruel satisfaction. Unless you agree to the assisted living placement and sign over full ownership to us. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at the phone in horror. Not only might she lose her home, Victoria was threatening to destroy it entirely. Rosa found her 20 minutes later, sitting at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face. She's going to tear it down, Margaret whispered. 40 years of my life, and she's going to erase it like it never existed. The emergency neighborhood meeting that afternoon filled the community center beyond capacity. Word had spread quickly through social media and local news coverage, and Margaret was stunned to see not just neighbors, but strangers who had been following her story. This affects all of us, Carlos Delgado announced to the packed room. Property, values, neighborhood character, the precedent it sets for developers buying up family homes. He gestured toward a man in the front row. Jim Morrison here has been tracking similar cases across the county. Jim? Morrison, a retired urban planner, stood with a folder of documents. I've identified 12 cases in the past 2 years where elderly homeowners were forced out and their properties immediately sold to developers. The pattern is always the same. Family members claim incompetency, rush through sales, and pocket the profits while the senior loses everything. Margaret listened to the discussion swirling around her. Zoning concerns, property assessments, legal precedents. But all she could think about was the kitchen where she'd taught David to bake cookies, the bedroom where she'd read bedtime stories to both her sons, the garden where Eleanor had spent her final months watching hummingbirds. At the feeder, Tommy approached her during a break in the meeting. Mrs. Chen, I've been researching Victoria's finances. It's worse than we thought. He showed her his laptop screen. She owes over $60,000 in credit card debt, has a second mortgage on their house, and he lowered his voice. I found evidence of gambling debts. She's been borrowing money from some very dangerous people. The pieces clicked into place for Margaret. Victoria wasn't just greedy. She was desperate, cornered, and cornered people were capable of anything. How much time do we have? Margaret? Asked Sarah, who had been conferring with other lawyers who had volunteered their services. If she really has a developer lined up, maybe hours. We can file for an emergency injunction, but that requires proving you have legal standing to block the sale. Sarah's expression was grim. And with the conservatorship hearing tomorrow, if David testifies that you're incompetent. Margaret stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. I need to see David, face to face. Margaret? I don't think that's wise, Michael said quickly. Victoria will be there. It could be a trap. Then come with me, both of you. Margaret looked between her sons. This ends tomorrow, one way or another. But tonight, I want David to look at me. Really look at me. And then tell the world I'm incompetent. The drive to David's house felt like traveling through her own history. Margaret recognized every landmark, the park where she'd pushed, both boys on swings, the corner store where they'd bought penny candy, the street where David had learned to ride his bicycle. Each memory was a reminder of what Victoria was trying to steal. David's house was a modest ranch style in a subdivision built in the 1990s. Margaret could see signs of financial stress, peeling paint, overgrown landscaping, a car in the driveway that should have been replaced years ago. Victoria answered the door with a smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret, what a surprise. And Michael, how lovely. Her voice carried the same false warmth Margaret had heard for 8 years, but now she could hear the calculation beneath. David appeared behind his wife, and Margaret's heart broke at the sight of her younger son. He looked exhausted, defeated, like a man who had been fighting a losing battle for so long he'd forgotten what winning felt like. Mom, he said quietly, you shouldn't be here. David, look at me. Margaret stepped forward, ignoring Victoria's attempt to block her path. Really look at me. Do I seem confused to you? Incompetent? Unable to make my own decisions? David's eyes met hers for the first time in weeks, and Margaret saw the struggle playing out across his face. Love warred with fear, family loyalty battled financial desperation. Tell her about the developer, Victoria said sharply. Tell her what I discussed. There's a company that wants to buy the house, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're offering 20% above market value for a quick close. Because they plan to tear it down immediately, Michael said, his voice hard with anger. David, that's our childhood home. That's where Dad taught us to play baseball. In the backyard. Where Mom nursed us through every illness. Don't you think I know that? David's composure finally cracked. Don't you think this is killing me? But we're going to lose our house, Michael. Our kids will have to change schools. Victoria says this is the only way. Victoria says. Michael's voice cut through his brother's explanation. Victoria says. Victoria thinks. Victoria wants. What do you say, David? What do you think? Margaret watched her younger son struggle with the question that would define the rest of his life. She could see the moment he made his choice. His shoulders sagged, his eyes dropped to the floor. I have to think about my family, he said finally. We are your family, Margaret replied, softly. But I understand. You've made your choice. As they prepared to leave, Victoria followed them to the car. You can stop this, Margaret. Sign the papers, accept the placement, and I'll make sure you get a generous settlement. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Margaret turned to face her daughter-in-law one last time. Victoria, what happened to you? What made you so willing to destroy people who trusted you? For just a moment, Victoria's mask slipped completely. Margaret saw not just greed, but genuine fear. The desperation of someone who had run out of options and was willing to sacrifice anything to save herself. You don't understand, Victoria said quietly. You've never had to choose between your principles and your survival. Yes, I have, Margaret replied. I'm choosing right now. That evening, Margaret visited Eleanor's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple granite with Eleanor's name and dates, and below it the words, "Beloved Sister" and "Teacher." Margaret knelt beside it, her arthritic knees protesting against the damp earth. "I don't know what to do, Ellie," she whispered. "You always said family first. But what happens when family breaks your heart?" The wind rustled through the oak trees that lined the cemetery, and Margaret could almost hear Eleanor's voice in the sound. "Trust yourself, Margaret. You've always known right from wrong." Margaret stayed until the sun began to set, making peace with whatever tomorrow might bring. When she finally rose to leave, she felt something she hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: absolute certainty about who she was and what she stood for. The next morning, as news crews gathered outside the courthouse and supporters held signs reading, "Justice for Margaret," Margaret Chen prepared to fight not just for her house, but for the principle that dignity and autonomy shouldn't be taken from someone simply because they had grown old. David would testify against her in a few hours. Victoria would present her carefully constructed case for conservatorship. But Margaret would stand before Judge Patricia Walsh and speak her truth: that she was a competent, capable woman who deserved to make her own choices about her own life. Whatever the outcome, she would face it with her head held high, knowing she had not surrendered without a fight. The battle for Margaret Chen's independence was about to reach its climax. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters by 7 a.m., 2 hours before the hearing was scheduled to begin. Margaret arrived with Rosa and Michael to find dozens of her former students holding signs reading, "Teachers Matter" and "Dignity for All Ages." Tommy had organized carpools from surrounding counties, and the local news crews were already interviewing community members about the case. "I've never seen anything like this for a conservatorship hearing," Sarah whispered to Margaret as they made their way through the crowd. "Usually these are quiet family affairs." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also strengthened by it. Each face in the crowd represented a connection, a life she had touched, a person who believed in her right to self-determination. Inside the courthouse, Judge Patricia Walsh's courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Margaret had researched the judge extensively, a fair but no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had built her career on protecting vulnerable populations. Judge Walsh had grown up as the daughter of Irish immigrants, worked her way through law school, and spent 15 years in family court dealing with the messiest aspects of human relationships. Margaret took her seat at the defendant's table, next to Sarah, acutely aware of Victoria and David sitting 20 feet away. David hadn't looked at her once since entering the courtroom, his eyes fixed on his hands folded in his lap. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Walsh entered. She was smaller than Margaret had expected, but carried herself with an authority that immediately commanded respect. "This is an emergency petition for conservatorship," Judge Walsh began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "I want to make something clear from the outset. This court takes these matters very seriously. The right to self-determination is fundamental, and the burden of proof for removing that right is appropriately high." Victoria's attorney, a polished man in an expensive suit, stood to make his opening statement. "Your Honor, this is a tragic case of a family trying to protect an elderly woman who can no longer protect herself. Mrs. Chen's recent behavior, locking herself out of her house, making irrational accusations against family members, threatening, self-harm, all point to someone who needs professional care." Sarah rose for the defense. "Your Honor, this is not a case about an elderly woman's decline. This is a case about financial exploitation, elder abuse, and a daughter-in-law's calculated scheme to steal a valuable property from its rightful owner." Victoria was called as the first witness. She took the stand wearing a conservative black dress and the same concerned expression Margaret had seen her practice in mirrors over the years. "Mrs. Martinez Chen," Victoria's attorney began, "please tell the court about your concerns for your mother-in-law." Victoria's voice was steady, sympathetic. I love Margaret like my own mother. But over the past year, especially since Eleanor's illness, I've watched her deteriorate. She forgets conversations we've had, repeats the same stories, gets confused about dates and appointments. Margaret felt her anger rising as Victoria painted a picture of cognitive decline that bore no resemblance to reality. And the incident with the locks? The attorney prompted. Margaret had been talking about feeling unsafe in the house, wanting better security. When she mentioned looking into assisted living, my husband and I thought we were helping by upgrading the locks while she was away. We never imagined she'd react so irrationally. Judge Walsh leaned forward. Mrs. Martinez Chen, you changed every lock on the house without providing Mrs. Chen with new keys? Victoria's composure flickered slightly. We planned to give her the new keys when she returned, along with information about the security system we'd installed. Yet Mrs. Chen found a note suggesting assisted living rather than new keys. The note was meant to start a conversation about her future care needs, Your Honor. We were concerned about her living alone. Sarah stood for cross-examination, her expression skeptical. Mrs. Martinez Chen, you testified that you love Mrs. Chen like your own mother. How often do you visit her? As often as possible, given our busy schedules. Would you say once a week? Once a month? Victoria hesitated. It varies. According to Mrs. Chen's neighbor Rosa Delgado, your visits averaged less than once every 6 weeks over the past year. Does that sound like the behavior of a devoted daughter-in-law? I have my own family to care for. Indeed you do. Family that's facing significant financial difficulties, isn't that correct? Victoria's attorney objected, but Judge Walsh allowed the question. We've had some challenges, like many families. Sarah walked to her table and retrieved a thick folder. Mrs. Martinez Chen, are you aware that your former employer has provided this court with documentation of your fraudulent expense reports? Reports that led to your termination 6 months ago? The color drained from Victoria's face. That was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that involved over $12,000 in false claims? And are you aware that we have evidence of your gambling debts totaling over $40,000? Victoria's carefully constructed facade began crumbling. My personal finances have nothing to do with Margaret's care needs. Don't they? Isn't it true that Mrs. Chen's house is worth approximately $600,000 and that selling it would solve your immediate financial problems? Objection. Victoria's attorney stood quickly. I'll allow it, Judge Walsh said, her sharp eyes fixed on Victoria. I'd like to hear the answer. Victoria's voice shook slightly. Margaret can't maintain that house alone. She needs professional care, and the sale would provide for that care. At an assisted living facility that you've already selected and that costs substantially less than the house is worth? Victoria didn't answer, her hands gripping the witness stand. The next witness was Dr. Kim, who took the stand with a thick file of medical records and test results. Doctor, in your professional opinion, is Mrs. Chen mentally competent? Sarah asked. Absolutely. I've conducted comprehensive cognitive assessments, including memory tests, reasoning evaluations, and judgment assessments. Mrs. Chen scored in the 91st percentile for her age group. She shows no signs of dementia, depression, or any condition that would impair her decision-making ability. And her physical condition? She has mild arthritis and some age-related changes, but nothing that prevents her from living independently. I have patients 20 years younger who are less capable of self-care. A parade of character witnesses followed. Elena Vasquez, the pediatrician who had flown in from Phoenix, testified about Margaret's continued mentorship of young teachers. Former colleagues spoke about her volunteer work and community involvement. Neighbors described her as the person they called when they needed help or advice. Tommy took the stand with his laptop, presenting the evidence of Victoria's online research and social media manipulation. Judge Walsh studied the printed pages with obvious interest. Mr. Nakamura, you've documented months of searches about conservatorships and assisted living facilities? Yes, Your Honor. The searches began long before Mrs. Chen showed any signs of needing care. Mrs. Martinez Chen was planning this for months. Margaret watched David throughout the morning, seeing him grow more uncomfortable with each piece of testimony that exposed Victoria's deception. When his name was called as a witness, he walked to the stand like a man approaching his own execution. Victoria's attorney began gently. Mr. Chen, you've lived near your mother for your entire adult life. Have you noticed changes in her behavior recently? David's voice was barely audible. She's been sad since Eleanor got sick. And have you been concerned about her ability to live alone? Margaret held her breath, watching her younger son struggle with the question that would define their relationship forever. David started, then stopped. He looked across the courtroom at Margaret for the first time that day, and she saw tears forming in his eyes. I've been concerned about a lot of things. About my marriage, about my debts, about whether I'm strong enough to do the right thing. Victoria's attorney looked confused. Mr. Chen, the question was about your mother's competency. David straightened in his chair, and Margaret saw a glimmer of the boy who had once stood up to bullies, twice his size. My mother is the smartest, strongest person I know. She raised 2 sons alone, taught thousands of students, and built a life that made everyone around her better. The only person in this courtroom who isn't competent to make decisions is me, because I let fear make me forget who she is. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Victoria's face went white with fury. Your Honor, Victoria's attorney interjected, the witness is clearly emotional. The witness is clearly telling the truth, Judge Walsh said firmly. Continue, Mr. Chen. My wife convinced me that we had no choice, that we'd lose everything if we didn't go along with her plan. But sitting here, listening to all these people talk about who my mother really is, I remember something she taught me when I was little. David's voice grew stronger. She said that when you're facing a hard choice, you should ask yourself what kind of person you want to be when you wake up tomorrow. I want to be the kind of person who protects his mother, not the kind who betrays her for money. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as David stepped down from the witness stand and walked over to her table. Mom, he whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Margaret reached out and took his hand. You're here now. That's what matters. When Margaret was called to testify on her own behalf, the courtroom fell completely silent. She walked to the witness stand slowly but steadily, her back straight despite her arthritis. Sarah's questions were gentle but comprehensive, allowing Margaret to tell her story in her own words. She spoke about immigrating to America, building a career, raising her sons, and maintaining her independence through decades of challenges. Mrs. Chen, Sarah asked, what does your house mean to you? Margaret considered the question carefully. It's more than just a building. It's the place where I became an American, where I learned that home isn't just where you come from, it's what you build with your own hands and heart. Every room holds memories of the life I've created. Taking that away from me isn't protecting me, it's erasing me. She looked directly at Judge Walsh. Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment because I'm old. I'm asking for the same rights that every adult in this country deserves. The right to make my own choices about my own life, even if other people think those choices are wrong. Judge Walsh leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, what would you say to people who argue that your family is just trying to keep you safe? I'd say that safety without dignity isn't safety at all. It's just a comfortable prison. I've lived through my husband's death, raised children as a single mother, taught in schools where some people thought I didn't belong because of my accent. I've earned the right to face whatever comes next on my own terms. The courtroom was completely still as Margaret returned to her seat. Judge Walsh called for a brief recess, and Margaret was surrounded by supporters offering hugs and encouragement. When court resumed, Victoria was recalled for additional questioning by Judge Walsh herself. "Mrs. Martinez Chen, I've reviewed the evidence presented today, and I have some questions. You testified that you changed the locks for security reasons, but you also removed Mrs. Chen's spare key from its hiding place. Why?" Victoria's composure was completely gone now. We thought it was a security risk. And the note you left mentioned assisted living arrangements that you had already researched for months. How do you explain that? I was just being prepared. Prepared for what? For your mother-in-law's sudden incompetence that happened. To coincide with your financial difficulties? Victoria's attorney tried to object, but Victoria was already answering, her voice rising with desperation. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I've got creditors calling every day, threatening to take our house. Margaret's sitting on $600,000 while my family is falling apart. Someone has to be practical." Judge Walsh's expression was ice cold. "So this is about money?" "It's about survival," Victoria shouted, then seemed to realize what she'd said. "I mean, Margaret needs care, and the house sale would pay for that care." "Mrs. Martinez Chen, based on your testimony and the evidence presented, it appears you've committed fraud, elder abuse, and attempted theft of real property. I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation." Victoria's face crumpled as the full weight of her situation hit her. She had gambled everything on this scheme and lost completely. Judge Walsh addressed the full courtroom. "I've heard enough testimony to make my ruling. This petition for conservatorship is denied. Mrs. Chen has proven herself to be mentally competent, physically capable, and surrounded by a community that supports her independence. Furthermore, I'm ordering the immediate return of all keys to Mrs. Chen's property and enjoining any sale or transfer of the property without her written consent." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Margaret felt Rose's arms around her, heard Tommy shouting with joy, saw her former students crying with relief. But through the celebration, Margaret found herself looking at Victoria, who sat alone at her table as even her own attorney distanced himself from her. Margaret felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but sadness for a woman who had destroyed her own family in pursuit of money that would never have solved her real problems. As people began filing out of the courtroom, David approached Victoria one last time. Margaret couldn't hear what he said, but she watched Victoria's face crumple with the realization that she had lost not just the case, but her marriage as well. Judge Walsh called Margaret to the bench before leaving. "Mrs. Chen, your case has received significant attention. I hope you'll consider using that platform to advocate for other seniors facing similar situations." "I already am, Your Honor. This was never just about me." As Margaret walked down the courthouse steps surrounded by supporters and reporters, she realized that Victoria had given her something unintended, a voice and a platform to fight, for others who might not have a community to rally around them. The battle for her house was over, but Margaret Chen's fight for elder justice was just beginning. The walk from the courthouse to Margaret's front door felt like a pilgrimage. What had started as a legal victory in Judge Walsh's courtroom had transformed into something larger, a community celebration that spilled across 3 city blocks as neighbors, former students, and supporters accompanied Margaret home. Tommy live-streamed the procession, his phone capturing the moment when Margaret's key turned smoothly in her own front door lock for the first time in 2 weeks. The click of the mechanism seemed to echo through the crowd gathered on her lawn. "I'm home," Margaret said simply, and the cheers that followed could be heard 6 blocks away. Inside, the house felt both familiar and strange. Victoria had clearly been through it, rearranging furniture and removing personal items, probably anything of value that could be easily sold. But the bones of the place remained unchanged. The kitchen where Margaret had taught 2 sons to cook, the living room, where she'd graded thousands of homework assignments, the bedroom where she'd nursed her husband through his final illness. Rosa found her in the kitchen, staring at the empty spaces where Eleanor's favorite teacup and the little ceramic rooster had once sat on the windowsill. "She took things," Margaret said quietly. "We'll get them back," Rosa replied firmly. Sarah's already filed papers requiring Victoria to return all personal property. Michael appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 grocery bags. "I picked up some basics: coffee, bread, milk. Figured you might want to cook in your own kitchen tonight." Margaret looked at her elder son, really seeing him for perhaps the first time since his childhood. The expensive suit was wrinkled from the courthouse proceedings. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there was something different in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen since he was young. "You don't have to take care of me," she said gently. "I know, but maybe I want to. Maybe I should have been doing it all along." The front door opened, and David entered hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. The celebration on the lawn continued, but inside the house, the 3 generations of Chen family faced each other in silence. "Mom," David began, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know saying sorry isn't enough." Margaret studied her younger son's face, seeing the boy who had once brought her dandelions alongside the man who had betrayed her trust. The anger she'd carried for weeks had burned itself out during the courthouse proceedings, leaving behind something more complex: disappointment mixed with love, hurt tempered by understanding. "David, sit down." They gathered around the kitchen table where Margaret had solved homework problems and mediated sibling disputes for decades. Outside, the celebration continued, but inside, the work of rebuilding a family began. "I need to understand," Margaret said. "Help me understand how it got to this point." David's hands shook as he spoke. It started small. Victoria would mention how valuable the house had become, how it was just sitting here while we were struggling. Then Eleanor got sick, and Victoria said we needed to start planning for your future care. She made it sound so logical, so responsible. "But you knew it was wrong," Michael said, his voice carefully controlled. "I knew it felt wrong. But I also knew we were about to lose our house, that my kids might have to change schools, that I'd failed as a provider." David looked at his mother with tears in his eyes. "Victoria made me believe that going along with her plan was the only way to save my family." Margaret reached across the table and took David's hand. "Your family was never in danger of losing me, David. Only of losing yourselves." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Through the window, Margaret could see Victoria standing on the porch, her face set in hard lines of defeated fury. Michael answered the door, his body language making clear that Victoria was not welcome. "I want to talk to Margaret," Victoria said, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. "No," Michael replied simply. "This isn't over," Victoria said, raising her voice so it would carry through the house. "I'll appeal the decision. I'll fight this until..." "Until what?" Margaret appeared behind Michael, her voice calm but firm. "Until you destroy what's left of your marriage? Until you go to prison for elder abuse? Until you lose everything that actually matters while chasing money that was never yours?" Victoria's composure cracked. "You don't understand what it's like to have nothing. To watch everything you've worked for slip away." "I understand perfectly," Margaret replied. "I've lost my husband, my sister, my sense of trust in family. But I've learned that losing things doesn't give you the right to steal from others." Victoria's face cycled through anger, desperation, and finally something that might have been recognition of her complete defeat. "David's leaving me," she said flatly. "David's finding himself," Margaret corrected. "Maybe for the first time in years." After Victoria left, walking to a car that David was no longer in, the 3 family members returned to the kitchen table. "I don't know how to fix this," David said quietly. "You start by telling the truth," Margaret replied. "To yourself, to your children, to everyone you hurt along the way. And then you start building something real instead of something based on other people's money. Michael leaned forward. David, I've been thinking. My company has been looking for someone to manage our West Coast construction projects. It's not charity. We need someone with your skills. But it would mean steady income, benefits, a chance to start over. David stared at his brother. You'd do that? After everything? We're family, Michael said simply. That means something, even when we forget it for a while. As evening fell, the celebration on Margaret's lawn evolved into an impromptu block party. Tommy had set up speakers and someone had brought folding tables laden with food. Margaret sat on her front porch, watching her neighbors dance to music that spilled out into the warm night air. Sarah Brennan found her there, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a thick manila folder. I have a proposition, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Margaret. Your case has generated enormous attention. I've received calls from elder rights organizations across the country, from other attorneys handling similar cases, from seniors who want to share their stories. What kind of proposition? I want to start a foundation, Chen Foundation for Elder Rights, if you'll let us use your name. We'd provide legal assistance for seniors facing family exploitation, education about recognizing elder abuse, advocacy for stronger legal protections. Margaret stared out at the celebration, thinking about all the people who had rallied to her cause. This was never just about me, was it? No, you became a symbol, but you were never alone in facing this kind of abuse. The difference is that you had a community that stood up for you. Not everyone is that lucky. Then we need to be their community. Sarah smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. As the evening wound down and neighbors began drifting back to their own homes, Margaret found herself alone with her sons for the first time in years. Michael had canceled his return flight to California, and David was sleeping in his childhood bedroom while he figured out his next steps. Mom, Michael said as they stood together on the front porch, I want to move back. Not just visit more. Actually, move back. I can work remotely most of the time, and when I can't, it's just a short flight. Margaret felt a surge of joy that she tried to keep from showing too obviously. What about your career? I'll still have my career. I'll just have my family too. It took almost losing you to remember that the second part might be more important than the first. Later that night, Margaret walked through her house alone, reacquainting herself with every room. In Eleanor's bedroom, she found a note her sister had left tucked into a book of poetry. Margaret, remember that home isn't just a place, it's the people who love you, even when they don't show it perfectly. Build a life so full of love that losing one part of it doesn't break the whole thing. E. Margaret smiled through her tears, understanding finally that Eleanor's advice hadn't been about blind trust in family. It had been about building a life rich enough in connections that no single betrayal could destroy it. The Chen Foundation. For elder rights would be her way of helping others build that same kind of richness, that same kind of community support. Her victory hadn't been won alone, and she wouldn't let others face similar battles alone either. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed in her own house for the first time in 2 weeks, Margaret Chen felt something she hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death: hope for the future and excitement about the work still to be done. The fight for her house was over. The fight for elder dignity everywhere was just beginning. The auditorium at Sunrise Senior Center was packed beyond capacity, with folding chairs arranged in extra rows to accommodate the overflow crowd. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at nearly 200 faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, all touched in some way by the epidemic of elder abuse that had brought them here. 3 months ago, Margaret began, her voice carrying the same authority she'd used in classrooms for 35 years, I was locked out of my own home by family members who claimed to love me. Today, I want to talk to you about how to recognize the warning signs I missed and how to protect yourselves from becoming victims. In the front row, Sarah Brennan watched with obvious pride as Margaret delivered her third speaking engagement of the month. What had started as a single invitation to share her story had evolved into a regular speaking circuit, with requests pouring in from senior centers, community organizations, and legal advocacy groups across 3 counties. Margaret clicked to her first slide, a photo of her house with the changed locks. Financial elder abuse often begins with small violations of trust. A family member who takes over bill paying without being asked. Someone who shows unusual interest in your property values or bank accounts. A person who isolates you from friends and community connections. An elderly man in the third row raised his hand. But what if they say it's for your own good? What if they make it sound like they're protecting you? Margaret nodded knowingly. That's exactly how it happened to me. My daughter-in-law convinced my son that moving me to assisted living was the responsible, loving thing to do. The manipulation was so skillful that even I began to doubt myself. After the presentation, Margaret was surrounded by audience members sharing their own stories. A woman named Florence described her son's recent attempts to get power of attorney over her finances. An elderly man named Harold talked about his daughter's pressure to sell his farm and move closer to her family. The pattern is always the same, Margaret told Sarah during the drive home. The abuser creates a crisis, positions themselves as the solution, and makes the victim feel like resistance is selfish or irrational. That's why your voice is so important, Sarah replied. You're living proof that fighting back is possible and that recovery is real. The foundation they'd established was growing faster than either had anticipated. The Chen Foundation for Elder Rights had already provided legal assistance to 37 families, conducted educational workshops in 12 communities, and lobbied successfully for stronger elder protection laws at the state level. Margaret's role as a spokesperson had transformed her daily routine completely. Where she once spent quiet mornings reading and tending her garden, she now reviewed case files, prepared presentations, and corresponded with other advocates across the country. The work was demanding but purposeful in a way that made her feel more alive than she had in years. You've found your calling, Michael observed over dinner that evening. He was keeping his promise to be more present, visiting every weekend, and working remotely from Margaret's house 2 days each week. His home office was set up in what had once been David's childhood bedroom, and Margaret treasured the sound of his conference calls drifting through the house. I think my calling found me, Margaret replied. Eleanor always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe this whole nightmare was meant to turn me into someone who could help others. Michael had surprised her by how seamlessly he'd integrated back into her daily life. He'd learned to cook simple meals, had taken over the heavier household maintenance tasks, and had become genuinely interested in her advocacy work. The distant, career-focused son she'd known for years had been replaced by a man who seemed to understand that success meant more than just professional achievement. I've been thinking about something, Michael said, refilling their coffee cups. What would you think about adding a guest house to the property? Something small, but private. I could move my primary residence here, maintain my West Coast office, and travel when necessary. Margaret felt her heart skip. You'd really want to do that? Mom, I spent 20 years building a career and 2 years realizing I'd built it at the expense of everything else that mattered. I don't want to make that mistake again. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. David stood on the porch, holding a manila folder and wearing the slightly nervous expression he'd carried since starting his new job with Michael's company. I have something to show you, he said, following them back to the kitchen. David's transformation over the past 3 months had been remarkable, but gradual. The divorce from Victoria had been finalized quickly. She'd been too desperate to avoid criminal charges to contest the settlement. David had moved into a small apartment near his children's school, and was slowly rebuilding his relationship with them while learning to manage his finances independently. "I finished the financial planning course you suggested," David said, opening the folder to reveal a certificate and a detailed budget worksheet. "And I wanted to show you this." The budget was meticulous, showing David's income from his new position, his necessary expenses, and a modest but consistent savings plan. At the bottom, he'd included a line item labeled Mom's House Fund, AT, small monthly amount designated for helping with Margaret's property maintenance. "David, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "Not because you need the money, but because I need to contribute something real instead of just taking. I spent 8 years letting someone else make financial decisions for my family. I want to prove to myself that I can be responsible." Margaret studied the budget, impressed by its thoroughness and touched by the gesture. "This is good work, David. Your father would be proud." The mention of their father brought a moment of comfortable silence. Margaret had noticed that both sons were more willing to discuss their childhood memories now, as if the crisis had somehow made it safe to acknowledge their shared history. "There's something else," David continued. "I've been attending a support group for people who've been in financially abusive relationships. I know that sounds strange, but Victoria manipulated me the same way she manipulated you. The counselor says I need to understand how it happened, so I can make sure it never happens again." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "That takes courage, David. Real courage." The neighborhood had changed too, in ways both subtle and profound. Rosa had formalized the elder support network they'd created during Margaret's crisis, establishing regular check-ins, emergency contact systems, and educational workshops about recognizing elder abuse. The network now included 47 households and served as a model for other communities dealing with similar issues. "It's amazing what people will do when they realize they're all facing the same vulnerabilities," Rosa explained during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "Nobody wants to age alone and defenseless." Tommy's acceptance letter to UC Berkeley had arrived the previous week, along with a partial scholarship earned partly through his volunteer work with the Elder Rights Foundation. Margaret had written his recommendation letter, highlighting not his technical skills, but his character and commitment to social justice. "College will be different because of everything that happened," Tommy told Margaret during his last tutoring session with her computer skills. "I'm majoring in social work because of what I learned from your case. I want to help create systems that protect people instead of just responding after they've been hurt." Margaret's Thursday visits to Eleanor's grave had become a treasured ritual. The cemetery was peaceful in the afternoon, and she found herself able to talk to her sister about the changes in her life with a clarity that had been impossible during the immediate aftermath of the crisis. "You were right about family, Ellie," Margaret said during one visit, arranging fresh flowers on the grave. "But not in the way I thought you meant. Family isn't just the people who share your blood, it's the people who choose to stand by you when things get difficult." She told Eleanor about the foundation, about Michael's decision to move closer, about David's slow but genuine progress toward independence and accountability. Most importantly, she talked about the sense of purpose that had emerged from the trauma. "I think I understand now why you encouraged me to trust family," Margaret continued. "You weren't asking me to be naive or to accept betrayal. You were asking me to build relationships strong enough to survive imperfection. Michael and David aren't perfect sons, but they're trying to be better. That's enough." The invitation to join the board of the National Elder Rights Coalition had arrived the previous month, along with a request to testify before a congressional subcommittee about elder abuse prevention. Margaret had accepted both, recognizing that her individual victory could contribute to systemic change for thousands of other seniors. Sarah had been instrumental in connecting Margaret with the broader advocacy community, but she'd also become a genuine friend. Their working relationship had evolved into something deeper, a shared commitment to using their respective skills to create lasting change. "You've become the face of elder empowerment," Sarah told Margaret after a particularly successful foundation board meeting. "But I hope you realize that your willingness to be public about this experience is giving other people permission to speak up about their own situations." Margaret's legal protections had been strengthened as well. She'd updated her will with ironclad language preventing any family member from making decisions about her property or personal care without her explicit written consent. She'd established a healthcare directive that named Rosa as her advocate, with Michael and David as backups, only if Rosa was unavailable. Most importantly, she'd created a support network that extended far beyond her immediate family. The foundation, board, her speaking circuit colleagues, the neighborhood support network, and her ever-growing circle of advocacy friends had created a safety net that no single family member could manipulate or control. As Margaret prepared for bed one evening, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 6 months. The quiet, somewhat isolated widow who had been locked out of her house had been replaced by a woman with a mission, surrounded by community, and more connected to the world than she'd been in decades. The healing hadn't been quick or simple. There were still moments when David's betrayal stung, when the violation of trust felt fresh and painful. But the growth that had emerged from that pain was undeniable. Margaret had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, and had found ways to channel that strength into meaningful work. Tomorrow would bring another speaking engagement, another family seeking help, another opportunity to transform personal trauma into collective action. Margaret fell asleep feeling grateful for the journey that had brought her to this point, and excited about the work still to be done. The crisis that had nearly destroyed her had instead revealed who she truly was, and who she was capable of becoming. The standing ovation began before Margaret even reached the podium at the California State Elder Rights Conference. 500 advocates, attorneys, social workers, and seniors rose to their feet as she walked across the stage to accept the Distinguished Advocacy Award, her steps steady, despite the arthritis that still plagued her joints. "A year ago," Margaret began, waiting for the applause to subside, "I was a quiet, retired teacher who had never spoken publicly about anything more controversial than library funding. Today, I stand before you as proof that it's never too late to find your voice, and that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the most important work we'll ever do." In the audience, Sarah Brennan watched with tears in her eyes as Margaret delivered her acceptance speech. The Chen Foundation for Elder Rights had grown into a statewide organization with 12 full-time staff members, a legal clinic that had helped over 300 families, and educational programs operating in 67 communities. "But this award doesn't belong to me alone," Margaret continued. "It belongs to every person who refused to let me fight alone, every neighbor who stood on my front porch in solidarity, every former student who drove hundreds of miles to testify on my behalf. It belongs to my sons, who learned that love sometimes means admitting you've made terrible mistakes and working every day to do better." The speech was interrupted by her phone buzzing with a text message from Rosa. "Emergency at home. Come back as soon as possible." Margaret finished her remarks, accepted congratulations from fellow advocates, and caught the first flight back to Sacramento. During the 3-hour journey, her mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to one of her sons? To Rosa herself? To Tommy, who was now in his 2nd semester at Berkeley? Rosa met her at the airport with a grim expression. "It's Martha Kowalski, 3 houses down from you. Her daughter and son-in-law moved in with her 6 months ago, supposedly to help with her diabetes management. Yesterday, neighbors noticed moving trucks taking furniture out of her house." Margaret's blood ran cold. Martha was 84, a Polish immigrant who had worked as a seamstress for 50 years before retiring. She lived alone in a tidy bungalow, filled with beautiful handmade quilts and the photographs of grandchildren who rarely visited. Where is Martha now? That's the problem, Rosa said as they drove toward home. Her daughter claims she's in a memory care facility for her own safety. But Martha was perfectly sharp when I talked to her 2 weeks ago. And nobody can tell us which facility she's supposedly in. Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger that had fueled her own fight a year earlier. How did we miss this? We have the neighborhood watch network, the regular check-ins. The daughter was smart. She isolated Martha gradually, told neighbors that Martha was embarrassed about her confusion and didn't want visitors. She played the concerned caregiver perfectly. As they pulled up to Margaret's house, she could see Martha's bungalow 3 doors down. The windows were dark, the garden neglected, and there was a "for sale" sign planted in the front yard. "We have to find her," Margaret said simply. The family dinner that evening was supposed to be a celebration of Margaret's award, but the conversation quickly turned to Martha's situation. Michael, now living in the guest house he'd built behind Margaret's home, brought his laptop to the table and began researching Martha's daughter, Linda Kowalski-Burns. "She's got a pattern," Michael announced after an hour of searching. 3 previous addresses in different states, each time living with elderly relatives who subsequently sold their homes and moved to care facilities. In 2 cases, the relatives died within 18 months of the sales. David, who had been quietly eating Rosa's homemade pierogies, suddenly looked up. "I know Linda. She hired my crew to do some work on Martha's house last month." She kept asking about the property value, about how much renovations might add to the selling price. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place. "What kind of work?" She said she wanted to install safety features for Martha, grab bars, ramps, better lighting. But now that I think about it, most of what we did was cosmetic, things that would make the house more attractive to buyers. Margaret stood up from the table, her decision made. "We're going to find Martha, and we're going to stop this before it goes any further." The search took 3 days and involved the full resources of the Chen Foundation network. Sarah's legal contacts helped track down Linda's financial records, revealing a pattern of property transfers and questionable power of attorney documents. Tommy, home from Berkeley for spring break, used his tech skills to locate Martha in a memory care facility 60 miles away, a facility that specialized in patients with advanced dementia, though Martha's medical records showed no such diagnosis. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning when Margaret, accompanied by Sarah and a court-appointed investigator, arrived at the care facility to visit Martha. They found her sitting in a common room, staring out a window with the vacant expression of someone who had been heavily sedated. "Martha," Margaret said gently, sitting beside her. "It's Margaret Chen from your neighborhood. Do you remember me?" Martha's eyes took a moment to focus, but when they did, they filled with tears. "Margaret. Oh, Margaret, I've been so confused. Linda said I was sick, that I needed to be here, but I don't understand why I can't go home." The facility staff insisted that Martha was in their care under proper legal authority, but the court investigators' examination of the documents revealed forged signatures and falsified medical evaluations. Within hours, Martha was transferred to a hospital for proper medical assessment, and Linda Kowalski-Burns was facing charges of elder abuse, fraud, and false imprisonment. "How did you know to look for me?" Martha asked Margaret during her first night of freedom, sitting in Margaret's kitchen with a cup of tea and her own clothes instead of the facility's institutional gown. "Because someone taught me that when we see injustice, we have a choice," Margaret replied. "We can look away and hope someone else will act, or we can step forward and use whatever strength we have to fight back." Martha's case became the Foundation's most high-profile success story, leading to stricter oversight of memory care facility admissions and stronger penalties for financial elder abuse. But for Margaret, the real victory was seeing Martha back in her own home, tending her garden and quilting in her living room. Tommy visited during his spring break, officially changing his major from computer science to social work. "I want to do what you do," he told Margaret. "Not exactly the same thing, but I want to build systems that protect people before they get hurt. The world needs both approaches, Margaret replied. People like Sarah who fight in the courts, people like me who speak out publicly, and people like you who work to prevent the problems from happening in the first place. Rosa had news of her own that evening. At 71, she was tentatively exploring a relationship with Carlos Mendoza, a widowed neighbor who had been part of their support network from the beginning. I thought I was done with all that, Rosa confessed to Margaret over coffee. But watching you rebuild your life made me realize that surviving trauma doesn't mean we have to stop living. Maybe it means we appreciate life more. Margaret smiled, remembering her own fears about aging alone. Eleanor always said that love isn't a finite resource. The more we give away, the more we seem to have. On the anniversary of Judge Walsh's verdict, Margaret made her weekly visit to Eleanor's grave. The headstone was now surrounded by a small garden that Michael had planted and David maintained, flowers that bloomed in rotation throughout the year, ensuring that Eleanor's resting place was never without color. I think I finally understand what you meant about family, Margaret said aloud, arranging fresh tulips in the stone vase. You weren't asking me to trust blindly or to accept betrayal. You were asking me to build relationships strong enough to survive imperfection and grow from struggle. She told Eleanor about Martha's rescue, about the Foundation's expanding work, about Michael's guest house, and David's steady progress toward financial independence. Most importantly, she talked about the family she'd created beyond blood relations. The BIAM, chosen family of advocates, neighbors, former students, and fellow fighters who had made her life richer than she'd ever imagined possible. I think our fight honored your memory, Margaret continued, not because we stayed silent and accepted what happened, but because we fought back with love instead of bitterness. We built something bigger and stronger from the pieces of what was broken. That evening, Margaret hosted her monthly Foundation board meeting in her living room. 12 people gathered around her coffee table, reviewing cases, planning educational programs, and strategizing legislative advocacy. The room buzzed, with the energy of people united in common purpose. As the meeting wound down and board members began, saying their goodbyes, Margaret stood on her front porch watching them walk to their cars. The streetlights illuminated a neighborhood that looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago, but felt completely transformed. Michael emerged from his guest house, carrying a cup of tea and settling into the porch chair beside her. Good meeting? Very good. We're going to help fund a legal clinic in Fresno, and Sarah thinks we can get the state legislature to strengthen guardianship, oversight laws. And personally, how are you doing? Margaret considered the question seriously. I'm grateful for the hardship that taught me who I really was, for the community that refused to let me face it alone, for the work that gives my days meaning. She paused, looking at her son. For family relationships that are honest now instead of just comfortable. David's truck pulled into the driveway, and Margaret watched her younger son walk up the front path. He'd been working late on a project for Michael's company, a sustainable housing development that would include affordable senior living options. His transformation from the weak-willed man who had betrayed her trust to someone who took responsibility, for his choices hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been genuine. Family dinner Sunday? David asked as he reached the porch. Always, Margaret replied. Rosa's making pot roast. As her sons said their goodnights, and Margaret prepared to go inside, she took one last look at her house. The blue front door looked exactly the same as it had when Victoria had taped that cruel note to its surface, but everything else had changed. The woman who had been locked out of this house was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more connected, more purposeful. The family that had been fractured by greed and manipulation had been rebuilt on foundations of honesty and mutual respect. The community that had rallied to support one elderly woman had been transformed into a permanent network of protection and advocacy. Margaret Chen unlocked her front door with the same key she'd always used, but she was no longer the same person who had once fit that lock. She was someone who had fought for her dignity and won, someone who had turned personal trauma into a force for justice, someone who had learned that home isn't just a place you defend, it's a foundation from which you reach out to help others find their way to safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families in crisis, new opportunities to fight for the principle that every person deserves to age with dignity and respect. But tonight, Margaret was home, surrounded by love that had been tested and proven strong, ready to face whatever came next with the confidence of someone who had already survived the worst and discovered that survival could be the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of her life. The fight for elder rights would continue. Margaret Chen would be leading it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.